Morning. I'm Dr. Ralph Hawkins, professor of religion at Avery University and director of the program of religion there, and also United Methodist pastor. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning at Mount Vernon United Methodist Church, and appreciate Pastor Jay asking me to share a message with you this morning. So I trust you have enjoyed worship thus far, and I asked Jay if there were particular topics that might be especially pertinent to address at this time. And he said something that is probably on everyone's minds is frustration and loneliness as a result of not being able to meet. And so I wanted to speak to that just for a little while. The title of my message this morning is Rebuilding Community in a Quarantine World. And so I'm going to share with you some thoughts about loneliness and about what the church has to say about it. About 20 years ago, there was a Harvard sociologist named Robert Putnam who wrote a book called Bowling Alone: The Collapse and Revival of American Community. And in that book, he shows how since about 1980, Americans have become increasingly disconnected. They've become disconnected from family, from friends, from neighbors, from community structures, whether it's the PTA or their church or recreation clubs, service clubs, political parties, or bowling leagues. Since about 1980, people have just become disconnected from those kinds of organizations. And there are a lot of reasons for the decline in community in our society, and he explores all these in his book, Bowling Alone. One of the major reasons is the shift from an agricultural to an industrial society has led to an entire generation moving from the country to the city. And now, with the continued commercialization of our society, people have to go where the job is. So they continue to move further away. And then we end up with suburbs where no one knows anyone and there are no sidewalks. There's no need to build them because everybody leaves the suburbs to go to work. And we don't even build front porches in these communities. We build the porches out back, and we put up a privacy fence around the entire property. So people just become more and more isolated. There's a recent book by two authors, Olds and Schwartz, titled The Lonely American. And in their book, The Lonely American, they point out that today, 25% of U.S. households consist of only one person. That's a really high number. And they go on to talk about that and make the point that more people live alone in America today than ever before. And that's not the way people lived in human history up until this modern era. In previous ages, people lived in households with that were intergenerational. The grandparents lived there, the mother and father lived there, the children lived there, and sometimes the grandchildren as well. So many families in one household. But the result of all these changes that Putnam talks about in Bowling Alone and that Olds and Schwartz talk about in The Lonely American, the result of all these changes is that loneliness has become what all of these authors call a social epidemic. And that was before the quarantine started. Now, with all so-called non-essential workers having been quarantined in their homes for more than 6 months, these problems have intensified. The problem of loneliness has intensified. Well, as the months have passed, there's been a tremendous amount of debate about whether or not it's essential to reopen. And many people have said that society will change from this point forward, that we just don't need to do so much in person. Some people have argued that we will start to do more things remotely. People will work remotely. They'll have their groceries delivered. They'll shop for their cars online. People just won't go out like they used to. They won't gather like they used to. And there's even been some debate about whether it's really essential for churches to meet in person. Some people have said that it ought to be sufficient to just watch a service on television. Well, these debates are really surprising, and they should be surprising, because scientists have known for years that human beings have an inherent need for closeness with one another. This is not just an idea that's fabricated or that people claim. Human beings actually have an inherent need for closeness with one another. And that what scientists have discovered is that loneliness can have devastating consequences. There's a very famous study that was published in 1945 by a man named Dr. Rene Spitz. And he looked at what happened to infants who were placed in a European foundling hospital during World War II. Founding hospitals were built during that period to place infants who had been displaced due to war. They'd been abandoned, or the family was killed and the infant survived, things like that. In the foundling hospital that Spitz studied, there was only one nurse for every 12 infants. And so while the babies received adequate medical attention and food, they were very rarely handled or held by the baby nurses, by their nurses, by the busy nurses. What do you think happened to these babies? Well, 30% of them died within the first year. And those who survived, by the time they were 4 years old, most of them could not stand, walk, or talk by the age of 4. And many of them had become developmentally delayed in a variety of ways. Well, what Dr. Spitz concluded was that the deaths of the 30% and the failure to thrive among those who survived was because of the lack of human contact, being held, being coddled, being talked to, rocked, walked, all these kinds of things. And his study resulted in changes in the way foundling hospitals were run. They realized babies need to be held and cared for in physical ways. Many years later, in 1990, two authors, Cacioppo and Patrick, wrote another book on loneliness. And in that book, they summarized everything that scientists have come to understand about the harmful effects of loneliness in the years that have passed since 1945. And they explain in their book that being disconnected diminishes happiness, it diminishes health, it reduces longevity, it increases aggression, and it's connected with increasing rates of violent crime. And they said that communities with fewer social bonds have lower educational performance, more teen pregnancy, more child suicide, low birth weights, and even higher rates of prenatal mortality. All right. What we see from the science is that getting together with other people is not non-essential at all. It is a fact of reality that we need each other. People need each other. And this is not some kind of a new discovery of science, but it's a truth that goes all the way back to the dawn of humankind. How many of you know that at the very beginning of the Bible, after the creation of Adam, the first man, God pronounced in Genesis 2:18 that it is not good for man to be alone. We can put that in gender neutral terms. It's not good for a person to be alone. It's not good for people to be alone. Genesis 2:18, it's not good for man to be alone. And then God created Eve so that Adam and Eve could marry, and they had children, and they built communities. Humankind was created for community. Humankind was created for relationships. Humans are not meant to be alone. And if you think about it, really the whole story of redemption that's told in the Bible is relational. As a result of the fall, humankind was estranged from God, right? In Genesis 3:24, they were also estranged from each other, right? After the fall, humankind was driven out of the garden and out into the world where the first murder was committed, right? So humankind was estranged from God, but also estranged from each other. The fall had vertical effects and horizontal effects. It affected our relationship with God and our relationship with humankind. And the effects of the fall permeated all humankind until God finally scattered humankind at the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11. Well, when God called Abraham and began to work out his program of redemption, it was a program of reconciling humankind to God, and it was a program of reconciling fallen humankind to each other. The Old Testament prophets envisioned a time when people from among all the nations would stream to Mount Zion to worship the living God. And in the New Testament, the book of Acts describes how that very thing happened on Pentecost when people from every nation heard the gospel in their own language. With the founding of the church, those who had been scattered at Babel could be made one in Jesus Christ. Paul says that through Christ, God is reconciling the whole world to himself and to each other, 1 Corinthians 5:19. Well, as reconciled people, we are a people in fellowship. The church is more than just random people, but it's manifested in a visible congregation of believers who band together to be the local expression of the church. The church is a people who shares a common allegiance to Jesus, and that forms a bond that's supposed to be greater than all other human bonds. Because of our loyalty to God through Jesus Christ, we're committed to each other. We want to walk together as a disciple band. We want to be a people in relationship with each other. God does save individuals, but he doesn't save us in isolation. He saves us together. He doesn't save us out of community. He saves us for community.